This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies, a leading academic program in Jewish studies that equips students with the tools to search out their own unique path into the study of Jewish history and scholarship. Based in Midtown Manhattan, the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies provides students a supportive environment and personal attention from world-class faculty, seminar-style courses, one-on-one mentorship opportunities, and career advancement guidance. Students can study in person or complete the program online from anywhere in the world. The Touro University Graduate School of Jewish Studies offers a Master of Arts degree in Jewish Studies with concentrations in Jewish history and Jewish education, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Jewish history, literature, and thought. The Master of Arts program includes in-person, remote, and hybrid options. Each program consists of a rigorous, well-structured curriculum in which students are able to discuss and debate ideas and delve into challenging texts with professors and with passionate, accomplished peers. Study with world-renowned scholars at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies, including Dean Michael Schmidman and Professors Schneur Lyman, Judith Bleich, Jeffrey Wolf, Susan Weissman, and Dana Fishkin, among other respected experts. For more information on admission to the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies, including scholarship opportunities, please visit gsjs.touro, which is touro.edu. So again, that's gsjs.touro.edu, or call 212-463-0400, extension 55580. And this information will be in the show's notes as well if you're interested in learning more about the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies. I would also like to mention, as always, if anyone would like to sponsor an episode, you can reach out, email me. There'll be a link in the show's notes via PayPal. You can also Zelle, svarimchatter@gmail.com, Zelle, or Chase QuickPay if you want to sponsor an episode, support the episode in any monetary form, less than a full sponsorship, as well as please enjoy listening to the podcast, subscribe, rate, and review wherever it is that you listen. Apple Podcasts most beneficial, especially if you can rate it and if you can write a review, but also Spotify. I don't think I mentioned 24/6. I don't think they have rating, but there or wherever else it is that you listen. And as always, looking forward to hearing feedback and comments. And you can email me as well, svarimchatter@gmail.com, and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Yitzhak Melamed, who is the Charlotte Bloomberg Professor of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. And we'll be discussing Solomon Maimon and his autobiography, which Professor Melamed is one of the editors of the new English translation that came out a few years ago with Princeton University Press. So thank you, Professor Melamed, for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, and it's a pleasure to be and an honor to be here.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I was born in 1968 to parents who just immigrated from Russia. I grew up in Bnei Brak on the border between the Haredi and the Mizrachniker world, with a strong influence of Russian culture. So, it's a very specific kind of culture. And I got used to living on the border, which in some sense is a healthy thing. So I'm at some age you are happy to accept that. I then went to Tel Aviv University to pursue an MA in history and philosophy of science, and did some work in history of logic. And eventually I went to pursue a PhD in philosophy, and my dissertation was on the metaphysics of Spinoza, which I've completed in 2005 at Yale University. Then my first job was at the University of Chicago for 3 years, and since 2008 I've been at Johns Hopkins University teaching philosophy, Jewish studies, and basically just pursuing and actually following the
So how did you become interested in Solomon Maimon, and then get involved in this autobiography?
So I like radicals, I remember that when I was in my early BA studies at Tel Aviv University, we used to have a chabura that would study every Thursday, and we studied all kinds of radical, whether it's the Kotzker or Maimon or Spinoza, all kinds of Jewish radicals. And now Maimon's biography was pretty crazy, and I was thrilled to read it. But then I tried to understand his philosophical works, and that was not trivial. So yeah, we can discuss that as well if you wish. But he has, I mean, his writing style in philosophy a lot of times is pretty complex and not very friendly. All this being said, he's probably a genius.
Okay, so we can get into that, and we'll get it. He's obviously a philosopher. We can get into the philosophy later. So we can first get all the historical background on him and the historical, the interesting parts of the autobiography, and then we get up to the philosophy. I guess whoever's not interested can turn off the podcast at that point, right? If it gets too heavy, dry, or boring. Okay, so we've been talking about Maimon. Who is he? Some are familiar, some are not. Who is he? When was he born? What's his background?
So he was born in 1753, probably, although there is some, it's not certain, but probably 1753 in a small village called Sukoviborg near the town of Mir in Lithuania on the Naiman River. His grandfather was an arendar, what we call in Yiddish, leaseholder and basically doing some businesses, local businesses. His father was a Talmid Chochem that was, he was not part of the top elite of rabbinic strata, but he was at the second group. Elchanan Reiner has a beautiful article about this kind of second rank Talmidei Chachamim scholars. And many actually, we know that many of the leaders of Hasidism came from these ranks, of people who were Melamdim, Shoichtim, and stuff of that sort. So his father was of that group. He himself was apparently a very talented and very curious child. He started studying, just like every child, he started studying Talmud very early on. And he started studying the Moreh Nevochim, probably, I would say, around 12 or 13 years old. And of course, at the same time, he also started studying Kabbalah and stuff like that. So,
okay, and a lot of information we know. He wrote this autobiography. We'll get to that later. Why, more about the autobiography. But we'll as we talk about his life, we'll talk about what we know from other sources and from the autobiography. So that will be what the discussion's about. We'll discuss more about the specific book after. So, you mentioned that he started learning more Nevuchim very young and learned Kabbalah young. He talks about this. You talk a little bit about, it's very interesting to read his autobiography, what he started, and he got married very young as well. So you want to talk a little bit about this, his youth, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. It's not that rare. We know about other rabbinic figures, perhaps even in the 19th century, that got exposed to the Moreh Nevochim pretty early on. You have the famous story also of Chaim of Tzanz.
Okay, and I don't know what you want to mention here from if there's anything else you want to mention about his family. Like I said, a lot of this is discussed in the autobiography, but if you want to mention, to the listeners, what happens to him when he's young, and I mentioned he gets married young, he talks about his wife's family, he talks about some of that. If you want to mention some of that.
Oh yeah, he gets married young. The autobiography itself is a fascinating text. It's well written, unlike all of his philosophical works, to be honest. I would say that if anyone wishes to understand modern Judaism, especially in Europe, I don't think there is a better text than the Maimon's autobiography, because Maimon is placed in the junction of so many movements. It's hard to imagine someone who will be involved in so many different trends, including Hasidism, traditional Lomdus, Haskala. He does not belong anywhere. That would be one of the interesting things about him. But we just to perhaps, if you wish, we can just quickly look into his biography. So after getting married and having children, probably at a very early age, he was just a Melamed in several schools. He heard about the Maggid. He went to the apparently went to the court of the Maggid and spent there probably a few weeks. We'll have more time to discuss that, but that's a longer and actually interesting, very interesting story. Then he returned back to Lithuania, stayed there for another 2-3 years, and eventually went to Berlin. The first time when he tried to enter the community in Berlin, the city of Berlin, he was just thrown out of this town because he came with his own some early commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed, and the German Jews didn't like the idea of an Ostjude coming with all kinds of bizarre ideas about the guide, what kind of a troublemaker it is. They just throw him out, and he, for a while, he was just keeping walking from one place to another just as a beggar. Eventually, he came to Berlin for the second time, and then he made acquaintance with Mendelsohn and became got to know the circle of Mendelsohn, of the Muskilim. And then something really interesting happened, because he was, on the one hand, he didn't have any of the manners. His German was horrible, but he was 10 times smarter than almost everyone there. And they didn't know how to deal with that guy. And he was also pretty bold. And so they were trying to find for him some sort of profession, so that will just, make him just part of the bourgeois society of the German Jewish Enlightenment. He didn't belong there. Eventually, at some point, he will be kicked out of Berlin. We can talk also about that. He had a very interesting relationship with Mendelsohn. I mean, because Mendelsohn was mostly a politician, and Maimon was, in many ways, just the opposite of that. I mean, when he had some idea, he would just pursue it without making any kind of social compromises or things of that sort. At some point, he left Berlin. He went to Amsterdam, probably because he was trying to understand something about Spinoza. He thought that perhaps he'll find there's something about Spinoza. He admired Spinoza already by that time. Nothing good came out of that. He was stoned in the street by local children from the Jewish community. And eventually he went to Hamburg, stayed there for 2 or 3 years in the local gymnasium, finished high school, came back to Berlin. Mendelsohn at that time was already dead. He started studying philosophy. At some point, he wrote a commentary on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and through a common friend, the manuscript of that text was sent to Kant. Kant read the text and said, who is that person? Because that's the best work ever written on my book. So suddenly, around 1790, there is a new star coming into intellectual life in Germany, and that's a figure called Solomon Maimon, who came from the East. Everyone thinks that he's savage, his German is horrible, but Kant is saying that he is the best philosopher or the best commentator, the sharpest person criticizing his work. At that point, 1790, Maimon writes his commentary on the first part of the Guide of the Perplexed, Givat HaMoeh. He also writes the second and third part, but it is never published because the Jewish Enlightenment is not interested in that. It's too philosophical, and they are not interested in philosophy. They are interested in just ideology and stuff of that sort. 1792 and 1793 is the point where Maimon writes his autobiography. And there he's at the zenith of his ascent. I mean, it seems like it's a story of a great success. It's much more mixed story. I mean, because he will never find a home. He left the community in East Europe. He stayed in touch, actually. That's one of the reasons why I'm saying I can say right now that he stayed in touch with the community is related to a finding which was occasional finding just from half a year ago, when in one of the auction houses in Israel, someone sold a copy of Maimon's Givat HaMoeh, his commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed, with his dedication to his brother. which means that he was sending the copies of the book to his family in East Europe at the time.
And when does he die? Just to enter the end.
1800. So he's supported by the German Jewish bourgeoisie of the Haskala, basically till 1795. They don't know what to do with that person. He's odd. He's radical. He's a savage. He does not have, and he is a kind of a genius. We don't know what to do with him. And then in 1795, we find another supporter. In this case, it's a noble German person from Silesia, who will host him for the last 5 years of his life. What we know is that in this, basically in 6-7 years of his life, he would usually write a book in a month, and then spend the other 11 months of the year just going from tavern to tavern, drinking.
Wow. So a couple of things to really, a lot to unpack there on what you said. We did kind of his full biography, but one thing is, you mentioned the autobiography, which is a really, what you edited, we're talking about, really fascinating, very interesting text. But he's arrogant and whatever. I don't know what the right word is for him, for Maimon, relating his own story as he wants to relate it. So, I mean, do we have a lot of what you said? Does it come from autobiography? Do we have these facts about his life from elsewhere as well, or we just rely on his autobiography?
Yeah, we do. So I can tell you that about 25 years ago, when I started reading or working on Maimon, and I remember I met my friend Abe Socher, who's now the editor of the Jewish Review of Books. Abe was writing his dissertation on Maimon. We had the same impression that you cannot trust one fact that Maimon relates, because there is a clear ego there, nevertheless, over the past 25 years, there were quite a few scholarly studies that confirm time and again very small details in his autobiography. So if we look, for example, at the number of chimneys in the house of his grandfather, so Adam Teller publishes an article from the records of the local nobleman, the Polish nobleman, which turned out to be to confirm every small detail in Maimon's account of the house of his grandfather. The details about the teachings in the cycle of the Maggid. So there are 2 articles by Yosef Weiss from the mid-20th century which confirmed some of these teachings. Then the Beit Asaf finds more conversations I had with my friend Abi Shor by Abi Shor, confirmed other other teachings and Torot that Maimon mentions in his autobiography. So right now, I develop a kind of attitude of keeping my chashad, but trying to see if there is anything true behind that.
Okay, so in the beginning of the book, there's a lot of really what he's discussing, his background, his growing up, and you mentioned getting married, and his in-laws, and his wife, and his mother-in-law, and he's discussing learning Gemara, Talmud, really, a lot of that stuff. I don't know if we go into all that, but you did mention the Maggid of Mezritch. You mentioned the Chassidus. He describes, it's a very early account that we have of describing what's going on by the Chassidish court. But as you mentioned, first of all, is it for sure the Maggid? I mean, to talk about that a little bit, who was it? Because he doesn't say exactly, and the description that he gives.
So he's saying that the 2 central places where Hasidim were converting were the cities of K and M. Most likely these are Kalin and Mezritch. Okay. Then he meets one of the emissaries of the Maggid, hears some of the Torot of the Maggid, and gets excited. And so he decides to go. He was in Lithuania. He could have gone to Berlin, but he decides to go to the most important figure. He's not going to stay in Berlin. He's just. My suspicion is actually that he is hoping to become one of the leaders of this movement. I'll can tell you why I think so, because he's stressing the stratified structure of these communities, so that they didn't allow him to get into the elite class, and there is a sense in which he is offended. When this visit happens, probably around 1770, because a year later the Maggid will move to Rovno. So we can roughly, and Maimon is then at that point 17 years old. Many of the students of the Maggid are actually at the same age, so that's not so unique. And he at least his first reaction to Hasidism is just enthusiasm. You can see that he likes especially their teachings of Bitul Yesh, or what he calls annihilation of the self, so that you can merge or submerge in God. And later, Maimon himself will adopt some of these teachings, and he will coin the term akosmism to describe that. In some sense, the notion of akosmism, which Maimon will later develop and introduce into German idealism, is taken from the Maggid. It's taken from the court of the Maggid.
Okay, so that's obviously something that's pretty famous from the book. His description of Hasidus is much more there. He describes what was going on. But there are some other interesting things. Like I said, he mentioned that he was a Melamed. He talks about that. He talks about a brief account of the Jewish religion he goes through. So there's kind of two parts here. I want to keep point to that. The book, a lot of this, and we'll get into philosophy, whereas some of there's just like biographical or historical anecdotes and information, and then there's kind of the philosophy or kind of, and not only philosophy, where he discusses other things, like brief, he gives a brief account of the Jewish religion. That's not like he's giving kind of, what's the right word I'm looking for, right? It's not just like historical anecdotes that he's giving.
Right. So, let's. There are 2 points I think that might be stressed here. First of all, Maimon's autobiography is the second book in the specific genre that we today call Bildungsroman. In Hebrew, it's Roman Chanicha. It's a kind of a developmental novel. The first one is by his editor, the person who edits the autobiography, Carl Philip Moritz. Now, it is a kind of a genre that is at that point pretty experimental, right? Now, next to that, I think that what you observed rightly is that it's a biography that is replete with all kinds of tangential, not really tangential, but discussions of the nature of Jewish religion, the nature of Kabbalah, Hasidism. And then the second part of the autobiography begins with no less than 10 chapters summarizing the Guide to the Perplexed. Now, between us, I can also tell you, I think that the chapters are fascinating, and they are probably the best discussion of the Guide to the Perplexed in German till today. I mean, they are insightful, beautiful. I mean, it's a little bit of a radical reading of the Guide to the Perplexed, but an excellent reading of the Guide to the Perplexed. Maimon thinks that in order to understand him, you need to understand all of these backgrounds. You need to understand what is Kabbalah, what is Hasidism, what is the life of a Melamed. And so he in some way, he's trying to explain to his German readers what is this world from which he came.
Right. Now, one more thing I want to just emphasize on the Hasidus part, I forgot to ask this before, is that how, this is a very early first-hand account of Hasidism. How important is this, or how many others do we have?
I think it's hugely important, because we just in terms of, first of all, in terms of external reports, I don't think that we have anything close to that. I mean, Maimon dedicates a chapter and a half to discussion of Hasidism. The other testimonies we have are about this period. We have few, but all of them, they are just tiny. They are tiny bits. Now, one of the interesting things also is that Maimon makes some errors in his description of Hasidism, but his errors are also telling a lot. So the first error is that he thinks that the founder of Hasidism is Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem, which, yeah, that's a. So is it, what's precisely is going on there? Is it that is it just the issue of the Maimon's memory betraying him 20 years later, that he's just confusing Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem with Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem? That's one possibility, quite likely. Or the other question is, of course, to what extent the Baal Shem Tov was a central figure in the circles of the Maggid, which is not clear, I think, today, at least in scholarship. So that's one thing. The other thing, with the great error of Maimon, is that when he writes in 1792, he's convinced that that's the end of Hasidism. He's saying, listen, if not for all the several political errors that the Hasidim made, they will conquer the Jewish world. He's writing that in 1792, and he said, no, the Gaon was able to stop them and eradicate the movement, right? Well, in the 19th century, Hasidism conquered the Jewish world. I mean, so he was his counterfactual was actually factual, and now, why it is the case that in 1792 one can think that Hasidism perhaps disappeared? A fair question. I mean, I think it's related to perhaps to some void in the Hasidic leadership after the death of the Maggid on the one hand, and then the immigration of the close disciples of the Maggid to Eretz Yisrael. So there is a certain period of time where it's not yet clear whether there is a continuation for this movement, I think, or that's my suggestion.
Now, interestingly, you mentioned the guy in the Vilna Gaon, as we mentions here by name Maimon in the autobiography, but there is a kind of story in Aliyas Leo that claims that Maimon met the Gaon. It's not in the autobiography; it's claimed there. So if you want to tell the listeners the story, and if you think the story is true or not.
Well, it's a wonderful story from Aliyot Eliyahu, which I think appeared 1830s or something like that. So it's in the biography, a geography of the Gaon. It's a very long story, so I'll try to do it to summarize it quickly. The story tells of Maimon coming to a certain tavern, hearing about the Gaon, being highly impressed about what he hears about him, and decide that he wishes to meet the Gaon. But he's shaved, and he doesn't know how to find an introduction so that he will be able to meet the Gaon. At the end of the day, he finds that he thinks that he has a device. Next morning, he comes to the house of the Gaon in Vilna, knocks on the door, and tells the porter that he's the rabbi of Padua. Why is the rabbi of Padua? Because Italian rabbis are shaved, right? So, and it's not only that he's the rabbi of Padua, he also brings with himself something like 30 letters from significant rabbis in Italy, all letters forged by Maimon himself, in which we have a story according to which there is a religious debate going on in Italy, and the Jews are forced to answer all kinds of questions. And Maimon takes the opportunity to present a series of heretical or problematic questions to the Gaon. And he wants to meet the Gaon and basically saying, that's not my question. That's the questions of that are coming out from this religious debate in Italy. Okay. The Gaon invites him in, and he asks him, who is he? And Maimon presents himself as an Italian rabbi from Padua, and also as the author of a book on synonyms. So the Gaon asks him, what's the difference between Ditza, Rina, Simcha, and I don't remember the fifth word. And Maimon gives an explanation of all the words apart from Ditza. And so the Gaon asks him, what about the Ditza? And Maimon will not say that he's wrong. He'll say, Ditza is not Lashon Simcha. so the Gaon is saying that Rashi states meforish that Titzai is shon simcha, and Maimon's answer, Rashi didn't understand pshuto shel mikra. Right? At that point, the Gaon is saying, okay, I got the idea. He answers Maimon in a very, very brief manner. He's telling him, listen, your 30 questions can be reduced to 12, because questions 1, 12, 15, 18, they're actually just one question, etc. These 12 questions can themselves be reduced to 5. And here's a quick answer to all of the 5 questions. He gives him a very brief answer to the 5 questions, and tells him to go home. Maimon leaves the house, or the house of the Gaon, and he goes to his hotel, and there are 2 guys waiting for him. They taking him by his shoulders, bringing him to the shul. He's put in a sad, a shekel, and it's the time of mincha, and basically everyone at the end of mincha, everyone who is leaving the shul is spitting in his face and moving head. That's now it's a wonderful story. I think the most scholars believe that it's total fabrication. Some of them claim that it's another figure who was a subject of this story, Abba Gluska, and that perhaps there was some sort of confusion between the 2 figures. It's definitely a possibility. There is one thing which is, to me at least, appears a little bit suspicious, meaning there is something in the account, because the entire account appears also in the form of a letter which Mendelsohn sends to Maimon and is opened by one of the people in Vilnius, right? And in this, again, according to the account in Aliyot Eliyahu, in this letter, Mendelsohn is describing his attitude towards Maimon, and you see that he is highly suspicious of Maimon. Now, that's actually the description of the relationship between Maimon and Mendelsohn is actually quite right, quite precise. And the question, how did the author of Aliyot Eliyahu know that? So one possibility is that he read the autobiography. It's definitely a possibility, and decided to. The other possibility is that there is some kernel of truth in this story, and I personally, I don't think that I can rule it out. I mean, I don't know how to place the story in Maimon's biography. When could he visit the Gaon or anything like that? But I cannot tell you that I'm 100% sure that it's a fabrication.
Right, because the years, technically they were alive at the same time. But what about the question of, would Maimon mention the story, mention meeting the Gaon, or no, that's not,
Maimon is
wouldn't,
not
because
because Maimon is an Uber Chacham. I mean, the autobiography it's filled with stories. Always at the end of every anecdote, Maimon ends up as the Uber Chacham, the one who came out the strong guy. That's not a story that would fit this period.
Okay, so that's just one story, not in the autobiography. Now, you mentioned Mendelssohn and his relationship to Mendelssohn. Actually, but before that, I want to just mention there's other rabbinic figures that he does meet or he mentions in here. Notoriously, one other famous one is Rav Raphael Hakohen of Hamburg. I don't think he mentions him by name either. If you want to mention that, he has a confrontation with him there, or if you want to discuss that story, or I believe that's what. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I hope I just get the story right, but my recollection is that in the context of his divorce, where his wife is coming from Lithuania and asking him to come back, and Maimon is playing dirty games, literally dirty discussing games. I mean, his wife comes with his oldest son, David, and for a while, he's telling her that he'll go back, and he's trying to raise some money so that he'll be able to go back to the East. But eventually, he's simply trying to find ways to take more and more and more time, and his wife is advised not to let him prolong the period. And he is basically, so what happens there is that he does not wish to give the get out of his free will, because and he's trying to tease the rabbinic court there to force him to give a get. And of course, he knows that would raise a huge issue of problems about get meuseh and stuff of that sort. And so he's playing with that. He basically is playing with his wife as well as with the rabbinic court there.
Yeah, that's what it is, with his wife being any good. And that's when he has this confrontation with the famous Rav Raphael Hakohen of Hamburg.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Who actually also knew his father, and then realized, if my recollection does not mislead me, it's not only that he knew his father, he also tested Maimon when he was a child, and basically said, "Oh, I remember him being I tested you as a child." Yeah.
Right. It's on page 219 of the new translation. Right. Okay, Nabila, you are the famous Rabbi Joshua's son. I know your father very well. He's a pious and learned man. I know you too. I tested you on a number of occasions when you were a boy, and I found you so full of promise. Oh, how is it possible you have changed so much? And he said he pointed to his shaved beard, and he goes through that. That's in here. Now, so now we should, there are others. Obviously, again, this is we should mention the autobiography is 250 pages. I mean, it's there's with the afterwards. So it's over 200 pages, let's say. So it's a pretty big autobiography. So now you mentioned Mendelsohn. You mentioned his relationship with Mendelsohn. Talk about him and Mendelsohn and their relationship, and yeah.
So in many ways, they're opposite people. I mean, both of them came from East Europe, but Mendelsohn became part of the German Jewish bourgeoisie, and actually not part. He was the leader of it. And it's clear that Mendelsohn sympathizes with Maimon and is trying to be mekarev, to bring him into his circle and support him. But Maimon is also a chutzpandik on the one hand, but also he's not the person who will make compromises. And Mendelsohn is a politician, so Mendelsohn would know, for example, that. You can see that Mendelsohn, at least to some degree, is sympathetic to Spinoza's philosophy. In his early works, Mendelsohn is trying to defend Spinoza's philosophy. But because in Germany in the 1770s and 1780s, the name of Spinoza is associated with atheism and all kinds of bad things, so Mendelsohn will avoid any kind of association with Spinoza. And Maimon is having several conversations with Mendelssohn about Spinoza, and his impression is that philosophically Mendelssohn knows who is right, but he is just for political reason not willing to go there. And so what you have is basically just two East European Jews, one becoming complete masculine and actually a leader of the Haskalah. The other one is a Talmudist that is making no compromises, but just Ikov Adin et Ahav. They like each other, but you see the clash, and the clash is inevitable.
And now this leads to Maimon leaving Berlin.
This leads to Maimon leaving Berlin. Also, he leaves Berlin for two reasons. One is because there are rumors that he's studying Spinoza and that he's a Spinozist, and there are rumors that he's going to all kinds of questionable houses and stuff of that sort. Yes. Yeah. But I think that there is also another thing which is happening there, and that's something that we could see just a few years later. They also have a very different notion of what a Haskalah is supposed to be, and this thing will become much clearer when Maimon will return to Berlin for the third time after Mendelssohn dies, and he is trying to find Panosa, and so the agreement is that Maimon will translate some works into Hebrew in order to propagate the ideas of the Haskala. Okay, and the disciples of Mendelsohn, they of course they are interested in basically in just ideology. So they are looking for either for a book on the history of Judaism, or a book on natural religion and stuff of that sort. And Maimon is saying, no, I want to translate mathematics and physics, because his understanding of Haskalah is basically is Maimonidean. I mean, he admires Maimonides. He takes the name Solomon Maimon, simply because of his admiration of Maimonides. And so for him, I mean, the study of physics and mathematics is just part of Avodat Hashem.
I realized that we got this far into the podcast and we didn't mention why his name is Maimon, Solomon Maimon. Exactly. He takes that name because of the Rambam, right? He decides that's why he wants that name.
That's right. And he also will tell us that for him, Maimonides was basically just the image of the philosopher, so that if he had to sworn something, it would be just to sworn in the name of Adonenu, the Rambam.
Wow. So he had the utmost respect for the Rambam. And as you mentioned here, two things we discussed. He has a commentary on Moreh Nevuchim, and he also, in the autobiography, which I believe this is the first time it's in the English one. The Old English one didn't have this, right? The philosophical chapters when he goes to Moreh Nevuchim. So you mentioned earlier, we teased kind of, we'll talk about his philosophy. So if you want to mention, just in brief, I don't know how much you want to mention about his philosophy and what he discusses specifically in the autobiography. That again is, I think, the first time in the English here in this edition.
Sure. So his engagement with the Rambam is, as you pointed out, I mean, he goes to it back and forth time and again. I mean, so already in the 1770s, before he comes to Berlin, he writes a manuscript which hasn't been published yet, called Cheshek Shlomo. In this work, there is a very significant engagement with the Rambam. I've transcribed most of this, together with a colleague, we have transcribed most of this manuscript. And then he writes this kind of short commentary on the guide with that he brings to Berlin. We probably have this commentary. Then in 1791, he starts writing a comment. His Givat HaMoreh, which is a commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed, that is supposed to present. It's supposed to present the guide, but in terms of Kantian philosophy. Bizarre work, really bizarre work. And of course, in spite of the fact that basically Maimon admires the guide, he, a lot of times when so for example, when he is encountering the chapters of the Kalam at the end of part one of the guide, he admires them. I mean, he's siding with them against the Rambam, because he thinks that they are sharp, and there is no reason not to support them. He writes a commentary on parts 2 and 3 as well, but then Yitzhak Melamed, who was the editor of the press of the Haskala, comes back to Berlin after a stay of a year in Poland, and discovers what Maimon did in his commentary on the first guide, part of the guide, and saying, who needs that? That's precisely what we don't need. We don't need deep philosophy. We don't need deep Kantianism. What we need is just propaganda for our purposes. And so he throws away Maimon's commentary on parts 2 and 3 of the guide, writes his own commentary, which is just shallow, uninteresting, literally just, no one could care about it, and how do we know all this? Because he writes an introduction to parts 2 and 3, and in the introduction to part 2 of the Guide of the Perplexed, of Givat HaMoreh, saying, I don't need this deep philosophy. I'm just interested in Haskalah ideology. In the Lebensgeschichte, we have these 10 chapters. Now, what's 10 chapters which are summarizing the Guide of the Perplexed. There are a few interesting features about them. One of the most remarkable one is the fact that these chapters are crystal clear. I mean, there are, unlike Maimon's writing in German, that is usually extremely complex, uneasy, commentary on a commentary on a commentary. These 10 chapters are clear, beautiful, penetrating. You have just no problem reading them. So that's the first fact. Another remarkable fact is that since 1792, almost all later editions of Maimon's autobiography just cut these chapters out. They either would place them at the end as a kind of appendix, or they would simply just publish the stories without the 10 chapters on the guide. So the English translation, which were the existing, the older English translation from a century ago, provides us with almost a complete text of the autobiography, apart from these 10 chapters on the Guide of the Perplexed, and one note about Christianity, which the translator found too offensive. So one of the things which we did actually in this new edition is just to make sure that we keep the integrity of the book as it is. We don't move chapters to appendixes. We just want to provide the reader with the ability to read the text as it was intended to be for the first time actually after 2 centuries. It's quite astonishing, right? From after 1792, all editions that I know, Hebrew, French, German, they started misplacing the chapters, cutting them, publishing a kind of half of the edition, moving the theoretical chapters to the end. There is some sort of disrespect. I think partly it is related to the fact that Maimon is an Ostjude, and there is a sense of, we don't need to respect the preferences of this bizarre figure.
Interesting. So, and what value, I guess, quote unquote, would you say that reading these chapters now that it's back inside the edition has?
Well, first of all, it's a great reading of the guide. I would say it's. I think it's one of the. Well, it's definitely the best reading I've seen in German, as far as I know. But generally, I think it's one of the most insightful reading, and he's pushing the guide slightly more. He's reading the guide like some of his more radical commentators. But again, it's a beautiful reading, and it also tells us something about what the importance of the guide in Maimon's own thought. Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to mention, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that was it Rav Soloveitchik was interested in Givat Amora in Maimon's commentary?
It could be. I mean, I remember reading something about that. I know that there is a story also about Rabbi Dalia Nadel that was looking at. I don't think that actually, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Dalia Nadel was not looking at the autobiography. He was looking at his Versuche über die Transzendentalphilosophie in the Hebrew translation. So, but other figures that we're interested. Well, at least in Givat Amora, one figure is Gochover, who is addressing him in his chapters on the guide on the Moreh Nevochim.
Right, I could be wrong. I seem to remember something like that.
Maybe I think you are right. I also remember something like that. So I think you are right.
Okay, so a couple other things about the autobiography. So you mentioned a couple times in German. So the autobiography was written in German. I mean, but you said his German was horrible. So did he write it with help? How did that? And how was it published? It was published in 2 volumes.
Yes. So his editor was Karl Philipp Moritz, who was a wonderful German writer and editor of an important journal. Maimon actually became a co-editor of the same journal. Now, so I see it's it is quite reasonable to assume that Carl Philipp Moritz edited the language. The only thing is that I don't think that Carl Philipp Moritz had any clue about the Guide of the Perplexed. So at least these 10 chapters, which were just about Moen Vochim, and are chapters written by Maimon. I mean, he could. I mean, Moritz could not basically try to tell him, listen, this is too complex, this is not clear. It's very unlikely. Now, the autobiography appeared in two parts. Well, the first part in 1792, second part in 1793. It was a bestseller. I mean, we know that it entered almost every German salon in the 1790s. Goethe is impressed by that and invites Maimon to visit him. It never happens. I mean, which is actually an interesting question. We don't know precisely what is going on there. But to think that the autobiography became a major source for, to my mind, German understanding or perception of Judaism.
So that's kind of two questions about the autobiography. But really, there's one, is that was this not only an autobiography by someone written very familiar, intimately familiar with the community, especially Eastern Europe, was this something unique that was published in German, and just in general that such an autobiography was published at this time in the late 18th century.
Right. So I think both, as far as I know, I think both features were quite unique. I mean, I don't think that there is, as far as I can see, I don't think that there is any other German text which comes even close in terms of analysis of Jewish culture, rabbinic culture in East Europe. But I think that even today, some of his insights about traditional Jewish culture are pretty impressive. The fact that he sees rabbinic culture as a kind of intellectual aristocracy. So, and that's probably a right perception, I would say.
Now, what about editions of the autobiography? So in translations, after it comes out in the original German, when do we have later? When do we get the first English? When do we get other translations?
So the English translation, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that Clark Moore, I think it's around 1900 and perhaps 1892. I'm not sure, but they're pretty early. So we have the Hebrew. You have the first Hebrew translation by Tabiov, if I'm not mistaken. And then Lachver has a translation from, if I'm not mistaken, 1940s or something like that. French and Dutch translations are in 20th century.
So this new edition, specifically, I mean, you mentioned the 10 chapters, the philosophical chapters. Is that all that was added here? Were there other things that were done in this new edition besides for a new translation?
Well, first of all, we there are quite a few other things, but let me try to mention them quickly. So one thing which we did was we try to identify sources. So usually you do it in a critical edition. There is no critical edition of Maimon works. Actually, I'm involved right now in a German critical edition of Maimon works, and specifically in the critical edition of his Lebensgeschichte, but it will appear in 2-3 years. So what we try to do, that at least some of the work that was supposed to be done in the critical edition, we put it already into the English translation. What does that mean is that occasionally Maimon miscites passages from the guide. So he intends to make a reference to guide 132, but he writes instead guide 123. So all kinds of typos of that sort that we find, that you see in Maimon, we're able to correct them. So basically, using the edition that Maimon used in the it's the Yesenit's 1742 edition of the guide, we are able to correct that. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we try to keep the Lithuanian Ashkenazi pronunciation of Hebrew intact. that would mean that we are not Sfaradizing the Hebrew as is a custom a lot of times for in among Israeli scholars or just also in the U.S. We want to see the precise pronunciation as it was as it was the custom by the end of the 18th century, because it's an interesting linguistic fact, and so we try to keep all of these kind of sometimes very bizarre pronunciations and just to see them and watch them, and there should be some sort of remnant of that, and we should respect that. Other than that, I think we try to provide some references to other works of Maimon and stuff like that, so which you'd expect from any reasonable edition. Yes.
Right. So there's another editor, there's a translator, there's an
Oh
afterword.
yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So you were one of the editors.
Right. One of the two. The other editor is Abe Socher. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, kind of in finality here, two things. First of all, for someone to read this, what do you think? Why would someone read this autobiography? What can they kind of get out of it, so to speak?
Again, I mentioned to you, if there was a creature coming from the moon trying to understand modern Judaism, I had to pick for him one book. I think that would be the book. But that's one point. I think the more interesting point is I think that what you see in Maimon is a different option for enlightenment, for Jewish enlightenment, for Haskalah. It's a much more traditional enlightenment. It's not trying to imitate necessarily German Protestantism. Instead, it is more loyal to some medieval and Maimonidean ideals. For that reason, you would see Maimon in his chapters on Hasidism describing the Hasidim as Aufklärer, as Maskilim. Now, for anyone else in Berlin, that would be just amazing. I mean, they would think the Hasidim are Aufklärer, are Maskilim. How can you do that? But Maimon is working with a notion of a Maskilim that is much more traditional. And I personally think that the German Jewish Haskalah was a great failure. I mean, philosophically and also just as a Jewish project. I mean, and I think that this failure is still accompanying us until this very day. I think Maimon suggested or denotes another possibility, a possibility which is in many ways much bolder than the Haskalah, but much more Jewish and much less servile to German Protestantism.
Yet Maimon himself was not religious, right?
Well, it depends on which age. So in his, I mentioned you that we transcribed his early manuscripts. So his early manuscript from the 1770s is you'll find a very systematic argument for the importance of observing the mitzvot, even for a radical Maimonidean philosopher. So at least from the Maimon of the 1770s, or 1775, 1777, he is committed to observance. 1790, 95, I don't think so. At the end of his life, there is a story about his a certain meeting he had with a priest who came to see him at the end of his life, where there is, there are two expressions there in this story. One is there is an expression of regret, where he's saying, I wish it was all different. God knows what he means by that. And the other one, he is saying, I was among the greatest of the great. Now, the question of who he has in mind, whether he has in mind Kant, whether he has in mind the Maggid, whether he has in mind other figures, I don't know. I think that it's probably all of them.
So, just to finish here, I mean, how do we define him, I guess? Is he this brilliant philosopher? Is he a heretic? Is he, Is he like a different early maskil, a different kind of maskil? Just saying, or is he everything plus more? It's hard to define him.
You can say it's everything plus more, but I think it's much more interesting to just to try to study him as a unique figure, and not to make not without making any concessions. I mean, again, I don't think that he was not a tzaddik. I mean, the way he related to his wife is disgusting, and the way he. I don't know the way he, for example, related also to the court in the case of the of his divorce is also pretty nasty. But there is something there which is, it's something which he, I think, inherited from Maimonides, and that's a willingness to go all the way straight of Yikov Adin et Ahar, making no compromises. I like these people. I mean, I told you I like radicals.
Yeah, he's definitely a radical, that's for sure. If anyone reads the autobiography, you'll see. And so, first of all, I will link to the autobiography in the show's notes. For those interested, can purchase it. Is there any other reading on him, though, you can suggest as well, if anyone's interested in reading anything else besides the actual autobiography?
Besides the actual autobiography, so there are some important study. There is an important book by Abe Socher. There are some articles by Gideon Freudenthal. And I think that more recently there is more and more work on his philosophy in German. I mean, the texts which he wrote in German are difficult, but the impression, at least I have, in terms of just studying them for the past 10, 15 years, is that they are either nonsense or just completely original and brilliant. So just trying to make the distinction between the two options is not so easy.
Okay, so with that, I will just mention again for the listeners that there's a lot of really interesting historical anecdotes and things that he describes that we didn't describe here. Just have to read the autobiography to see it. So those interested can pick up a copy, and it's in paperback now from Princeton University Press. It's not expensive, so you can put a link in the show's notes and check it out. And thank you, Professor Melamed, for joining me to discuss Solomon Maimon.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.